This is the first of the videos I'm going to show them in a series of how I built my cinema. I've done a full cinema room tour, but now I'm going to break down in detail all the components of how I did it. And you can follow along and see different parts of it that might be interesting to you, whether it's the construction side, the planning side, or some of the more acoustic design into the room as well. There's three major parts I did in terms of the planning, and this video is going to run through those three in detail. The major two are the actual designs of the room. So I started with some very simple designs, and I'm going to put them up on screen and show each of them in detail. The first ones were really just understanding the scale of the room and what I could achieve. And then once I knew that, I then went into a whole series of 10 plans or more of all the designs, all the measurements, and this is really the things that I could actually build the room off. So these designs are meant to be able to be constructed from. And then after I had the two plans, I then did a specification, and the specification was really, it's about a 12-page document, which is all the materials that I was going to need. It estimated all the quantities of everything, and in particular, it went through the sequence of like what order I needed to build everything in. So I'll show you that in a little bit of detail, but focus more on the actual plans for this one. And to go back now, the design of the room started actually as an upstairs room, which was the old living room area, and that space was always going to be a little bit tight to use as a cinema room. I did multiple designs trying to work out how could I get a decent screen size, and in that particular room it was still based on around about a 120-inch screen, because wall to wall that's about all I could fit. But what I couldn't do in that room because of the length of it is I couldn't fit 2 rows of chairs. I could technically almost do it, but they'll be like so squeezed tight, and the back row was going to be hard up against the back wall. There was a whole lot of problems that it was going to be created with it. So in some ways, as much as that started off as being the design, other things happened in our house renovation, which meant that I couldn't really fit a proper room in there. And the overall design changed when I came up with the idea of making the basement area or creating a basement area, and that was going to be a dedicated home cinema. So that then opened up to the room being a little bit bigger, and then big enough to do 2 rows of seats. That's where I started from in the design. I needed to fit, and it was really about fitting in minimum of 5 seats into my cinema. And once I had those 5 seats, then working out what the room dimensions needed to be, the layout, the orientation, where the door was going to be, what sort of maximum screen size I could achieve, and then with the tiered seating, all the sight lines. So let's break down some of those plans in detail. And so the first design really here is just trying to show an overhead shot of the layout from the stairs on the right hand side coming down into the doorway, and then trying to understand then from a baffle wall how that would fit, how much depth I needed behind the baffle, because I did know from the very start what speaker system I wanted to use. So I had the measurements of the speaker system, and then I tried to work out in the room where the tiered section would stop, and then what the seating position would be between the 2 walls, and whether I could fit 3 seats clearly or not. And the projector there is drawn roughly where it is in the actual build. And the other thing drawn into there is I knew there was going to be a water pipe coming from the kitchen sink above that ran somewhere around halfway-ish into the room, and coming across at least 2/3 or more of the room. And the reason why that became significant was I had to work out where the joists were going to be, the position of those, and work that around where that water pipe was going to be, as well as it not interfering with the position of the Atmos speaker. The next image was trying to understand the framing side of it. So as much as I've got the room dimensions, I wanted to then just have a small, tiny buffer off from those external walls, so that the whole inside of the cinema room is all framed out as a room within a room, so that I just came off just that small 50mm off from the concrete wall sides. And then I've just got a very simple 3-dimensional image of the maximum framing dimensions. And a lot of the times I was thinking at the start whether I'd put this into SketchUp and do all the drawings through there. In the end I decided not to, partly because I'm kind of like quite familiar and comfortable with drawing some of this stuff in 3D myself. And I also wanted to be able to have something where I could have all the plans laid out And so at all the construction phases, I'd printed versions of everything, and I could keep referring back to that rather than having to go off a SketchUp versions of things. Next was just again the first concept of how the baffle wall was going to look, and that was the speaker system, so that I knew how much of that front wall dimension was actually made up from the speakers, and therefore I could start getting my dimensions of the minimum screen size that needed to at least cover that void. I spent a lot of time trying to plan out these sight lines. I wanted to be 100% confident that the height of the riser was correct and that the tiered seating was not going to have anything between the eye level to the bottom of the screen through to the second row. So I've drawn out here, and there's a dot on the screen where I measured out roughly the position of the eyeball of the front row and then the eyeball of the second row. They're the two dots. And then I've got a 29-degree front row angle down to the bottom of the screen. And I also did some research here on what the best optimal dimensions were for the viewing angles, both from the top and the bottom of the screen, from the first and second row, as well as the side-to-side angle views. So here I worked out that from my front row position, I was potentially going to have a 29-degree view from the top to the bottom of the screen, and that was when it was in 16:9 mode. And when it was then in widescreen mode, that shrunk down to a 22-degree angle. Whereas the back row for the widescreen was only a 16-degree angle, whereas in 16:9 format, it was going to be a 20-degree angle. And again, how much of that sort of played into shifting the front row a fraction forward or back, it was really about trying to understand that the front row in particular wasn't either going to be too close that it was uncomfortable to view, but at the same time, I really did want to have a maximum screen image, and I didn't mind personally that that image was quite big, and if you've got a preference for sitting front row or back row, then you can do that. And part of the dimensions here were to work out how far did I have to work from the bottom of the ground before the screen started. And here it showed me that I needed about a 600mm start point so that the top of the screen still had enough space and it wasn't getting too high, that the front row eyeball was below the halfway point of the screen. And that was when it was in 16:9 format. So I didn't want to have a feeling in the front row that you are looking up. I wanted to feel like you're looking just straight at the screen. But at the same time, from the back row, you've got to have the clearance so that the riser height allows the back row person not to have any blockage in the front row person's head. Next diagram is the Dolby Atmos spec that I used to now try to work out all the speaker positions. And here the middle dot really is the front middle seat. And the aim here is really to work out in particular where that front wide is going to be positioned, as well as looking at where the rear speakers, in terms of the angle, wasn't getting too far either back or towards the sides. But because I also had a doorway going into the AV room, as well as a doorway into the room at the very back, I had to push that 150 degrees just a little bit. So I'm very much more towards the 150 degree line versus the 142 degree line. And the red lines down the middle of the page are for the ideal Atmos position speaker locations. Two diagrams here are showing from the front and rear middle seats what the angle of view is towards the screen. And I really wanted to try to work out how much of a maximum angle it was going to be for the size screen I was aiming for. And from the front row here, I worked out it was a 50 degree angle. And then from the rear seat, it was going to be approximately a 36 degree angle. So I was sort of comparing that to some of the commercial viewing angles for large cinema screens. And then the next diagram is showing where the Atmos speakers needed to be. So I've got the ear level drawn out here, and then the three rows being in a range of those positions, and ideally going between a 45, a 90, and a 135. And that's where I ended up trying to have my three rows directly measured from the front middle seat at those exact 45, 90 and 135 degree angles. So at that point, I've now got the initial diagrams to draw into the room so that I know the overall room dimensions. I knew kind of like the rough angles at where all the speakers needed to be, but I needed to draw the diagram so one, I could work out how much timber I needed to order, because I did all the measurements for everything from insulation to all the timber framing, the gyprock, every part of that. I did all the calculations for how much material to order, and I placed all those orders myself directly with the hardware company. But I needed all the designs in the next level of details, and I really started doing a series of 10 plans. There's a couple more extras later on, which is more around the front wall screen and how to do the masking in particular. And all the dimensions I did was based on trying to have the best Atmos and Dolby spec that I was staying within for a 9.4.6 system. And when I first started, it was actually 9.3.6 because I added another sub after the room was actually finished. The first plan here, again, this is just a top-down view of the room, and I've tried to just get the speaker layouts and all of the designs so that I've got the baffle wall dimensions shown. You can work out through exactly where the riser starts. So that was 4.44 meters off the front wall. The rear speakers in particular had to be done in a way where I had to do all the pre-wire as well. So knowing where those speakers were going to be, and I was still working out how to get the door into the back room at this stage. I hadn't worked out the exact location of that. And for the Atmos speakers, I've tried to align that just over a meter set in off the front wall, off the side walls, and that was to align very close to where the L&R front speakers were coming through from. And the two blocks here are the seating configurations. So at this point, I hadn't worked out whether I was going to do 2 front seats and then 3 rear seats. I was still toying with that idea. When I was drawing all these, I would literally spend hours going back over and then sort of repositioning things. So these did take multiple edits to get into a final point of being able to build across. You'll also notice that with all my designs, everything is drawn to scale. I draw everything very specifically to scale so I can get all my measurements later on. The second plan we'll go through now is, again, trying to get the speaker locations. So all the degrees that are around here is measured off the front middle seat, and then everything around it is working through the Dolby spec, trying to work through where those side speakers were. So you can see between 50 to 70, that's the recommendation. And I tried to find the midpoint where I can so that the sides were definitely in the exact spot I wanted them. The rears there between 135 to 160 was the guide, and I've come in right on the edge of the 160 point. So this has evolved the very first plan that was shown before. I've now got something a little bit more specific, and I'm coming in on those sort of just grazing on the inside of the 160 lines. I had a location now for the projector. I'm trying to make the projector location so that it is exactly middle of the screen. It's ceiling mounted, but it's projecting from the top of the screen. So it's not having to then shoot off axis at all to affect potentially image quality. But I'm also finding out then where I've got an air conditioning duct that's coming into the room. Now I'm drawing these designs before the air conditioning duct was ever made or whether it was actually finalized. So this was an estimated position of where it was coming in. And as you can see here, it's right very close to where the projector is. You can see all the lines going across into the riser section. That was trying to establish the framing that was going to be in that whole structure. The baffle wall there has also got all of the framing in what's underneath the speakers. So that's the bottom section. All the spacing between joists and between all the studs is all per building code, as well as knowing if I've got areas underneath the front speakers, and these are very, very heavy speakers, that I actually went a little bit more overboard to be able to hold all of that weight and never have an issue. The other trick I had in the room was in that back area under the stairs, you can see there's a drain drawn in that location where if there was ever water into the room, there's a fall going into that position, and that pumps back out upstairs and outside. So there also needed to be a hatch over that drain so you could get to if there's ever a problem in the future. And that became quite difficult because then that's actually exactly where I wanted to park my AV rack. But you'll see later on in my construction how we overcame that problem. Plan 3 is now looking at the front wall. I've got all the framing section laid out for the front wall, and you can see really that area where you see just the orangey kind of stud section at the very back has a framing section around it where all the speakers are going to sit within that void. And that's very specific dimensions to fit my KRIX MX40 series. Whereas the rear speaker here, you can now see I've got all the dimensions for the height of that all worked out, being 400. So my riser's 400. I've got a step into the room at 200 and a step up on the other side of the room towards the AV rack as well at 200. And the reason why I wanted to mark in all those locations is depending on where the speakers were, I've got extra supports between the studs to be able to then go in hard with all of my screws that are going to be having the speakers mounted on them. So all of the speakers are wall mounted. They're not in wall, they're wall mounted. I've got fabric panels that then are mounted over the top of that to hide them again. And in this diagram here, you see the air conditioning duct is still coming through there. That did move later on to directly above where the diffuser slot is. But the diffuser slot is kind of like wide enough that it needed that whole amount of space so that I really couldn't create a large hush box type area within that because I've got too much backing up to the other side of the projector area. I've now drawn in the door which is going to go into the AV rack area. I've got a hidden door written right in the middle of that plan. I never did that. That was another idea for some reason. I have no idea why I came up with that idea. It doesn't make sense looking at it now. I only ever went with the far door on the right. Never needed a hidden door. The next plan is another version of Plan 3, and all the only differences between this one and the last one is in green here I've drawn where the staircase is leading down into the cinema. And again, this point in time, I had the dimensions of how far this staircase roughly was out from the side of the room. So it's roughly accurate, but it hadn't been built yet. So I was going off the builder's plans for the layout, and I really needed to work out, was there any possibility of putting the projector so that the projector was actually mounted in the understairs area, and then it was just then going to be able to project out through like a port window into the room. If there was any way that I could have possibly done that, I absolutely would have, so that the projector would have been out of the room, the noise would have been out of the room, and I could have just done it through a separate area and maybe like a bigger hush box area in the room with the AV equipment. And I drew this to work out that there was actually no way I could do it because there was at least another meter of the stairs are lower than where the projector needed to be at the height of the top of the projection screen. So in some ways I did that to see that plan just wasn't possible. The next plans are the sidewalls, and there's different dimensions here purely because of trying to align in where the staircase and that lower level on the top diagram is coming into the room, and there needed to be some configurations that were a little bit differently around that for the framing potentially. Trying to then locate where the speakers were, and now I've got a layout that everything we did to build this room was off this diagram, so that we had the baffle wall section, and that came out 400 from the back wall. And between all the studs there, I could work out where the speakers were, and then we put a trimmer piece back behind the areas that the speakers were going to be screwed into, or the mounts for the speakers were going to be screwed into. And you can kind of just see roughly I've got those eyeballs drawn as well, just so I always kept an idea of what is the height of the eyeball for the front row and the rear row. And that was also to get my height of my side speakers, roughly where the ear level was of the front row in particular. I've also drawn into where the bulkhead location was at the rear. The bulkhead is going to hide the aircon plenum box as well as at the time going to be the design for where it was going to create a shelf for the projector to sit on. And in the end, that didn't work out, and I'll show that in a later video. The drawing here is showing the Atmos speakers and the ceiling height where it's set down 300 from the top of the frame, and it needed just that, and I created just a little bit of extra space above where those speakers were, just for a little bit of extra wiggle room for cabling, etc. And also there's a little bit of air gap between where that is and the top of the underside of the Bondex slab for the upstairs. Plan 5 now became the whole front wall and trying to understand the projection screen. I worked through probably a couple of versions of this, and one was a smaller screen, and then I kept increasing the screen size because I thought, well, I can actually fit a slightly bigger screen in. The minimum was I wanted to cover off the void, and that's that dotted dashed line. That's the void of where the speakers are. So I wanted the projection screen to be at least that wide, but I also wanted to be able to have a masking system, and I knew I wanted that from day one. So I was drawing in here how that masking system might work by having some studs going on the far left and right where the blind mechanism was mounted to, and that was possibly holding that a guide track where the bottom mask was running within a guide track. So that needed enough space where it was offset against the side wall so it wasn't too crowded, but I also knew that I wanted to try to mask that again with another panel that was going to sit over the side of that. And you can see that top view, there's an acoustic fabric panel drawn that goes from the side of the wall. It just covers where the motor and kind of that side of the blind is covering out, but it doesn't cover where the screen edge meets it. The masking heights here, which are those red lines, that was going to be the maximum that it would drop down and come up to. And I needed to understand that because to try to work out how was this whole thing going to move, and was it going to be winding the fabric around, or was it going to be a static thing that just kind of moved a level and it just all moved up and down without rolling the fabric? Because I was worried about that, because a velvet type fabric rolling around and might have sort of distorted that over time versus keeping it as really just a fabric panel that moved up and down. So the design here was to say, well, how far did that need to come down? And in this diagram, I really try to show from the differences of a scope layout, being the red lines, versus when it went up and covered up the 16:9, it needed to move by 250 mil. So for me, that gave me the measurement of my whole masking system only needed to move by 250 mil between, and at the time I was looking for a 155-inch screen. I think that changed later on to 160. But at that size dimensions, that gave me my layout of then where to mount the blinds roller bars at the top and the bottom. The dimensions of all this was the things I was probably least confident about with all of the plans. It was the most difficult to work out. I didn't exactly know how the masking system was going to work, but I had made a pilot version of it, which was literally just from an old blind that was just a meter wide, and just to seeing that if I back wound the bottom rail and front wound the top rail, that by doing a motion to activate the top one, it would pull up the bottom one by the equal dimensions. So I had a confidence that when I was going to build it, it was going to work based on doing that, but how much it needed to move by and whether I was going to be able to fit that in my room and not run out of space at the bottom of the screen before it hit the floor, that was the question mark I didn't quite know. The next plan here, I actually drew this when I was trying to talk to a commercial blinds place so that they kind of knew, all right, if all I'm doing is supplying a blinds, a roller bar and the bar that is the bottom bar, what is the actual length and dimensions of all that? This was to try to just show them what I was actually trying to achieve. And they looked at that diagram and said, that will never work. So in the end, I did find someone that would sell me the parts, and it absolutely does work, but I could never convince people from showing them here that you could actually wire from the very, very side another cable around that top roller bar connected to the bottom blind's top bar that would pull it up at the same rate as what the top blind was lowering by. They couldn't get their head around that. They said you can't do something like that. That's doing two different directions. Plan 6 is now the absorption panels. So I've got the dimensions of the room. I've got the locations of where the speakers are, which are the two black boxes on each side. And what I've shown here is that each wall has got 5 absorption panels, which are the sort of medium-sized rectangles, and they're going to be now sitting in those locations. The front one was measured based on that first reflection concept, so that's positioned around about that position. And it's no coincidence that those absorption panels, I've got dimensions for 1200 long by 600 wide. And the reason why that worked out is because that then fit one piece of my insulation material. And it's not regular insulation material, it's the thicker rock wool, mineral wool type, but it's also the dimensions where I knew if I could fit 2 in between the two sides, then I needed to then also do my dimensions of the fabric wall panels, which is the darker black 4 panels on that top drawing. I needed to do those so that they would fit and hide the absorption panels behind them. So there's a lot going on behind these walls, both between the acoustic panels being mounted, the voids that are cut out for the speakers, as well as there's smart lighting tracks hiding in the top and the bottom of the fabric panels that are running the whole length of the wall as well. And then on the other wall, the left wall marked down the bottom, I had to make that different dimensions because at the top you've got the stairwell coming into the room, and then of the left-hand wall there's no stairwell, so I've got another 750mm wide panel to make that fill it, so it goes from the front of the wall all the way to the rear door. Plan 7 is actually potentially really hard to see what's going on here. I was in my head trying to work out how to do these fabric wall panels, and I really wanted to have some sort of LED lighting strips, and I didn't know originally whether I was going to run those lighting strips vertical at different junctures or whether to run it horizontal the length of the room. And that's what I ended up doing. And what this diagram is trying to show is from the bottom of that picture, that's the concrete wall, that is the side wall. And then I've got this air gap between where that is, between that and when the framing for the actual room within a room starts. And it's only like an inch. But that side wall, you can see there the studs are marked out, 70mm studs, and I've got a plywood backing to all of the studs. So it's not even an open backing. We've literally tried to encase this room within a room and put plywood along the whole back of all of the walls as well on the sides. And then from there, the stud has got another layer of plywood on the inside of the room facing section. And then there's a green glue applied to that, a version of a very dense gyprock called Soundcheck, which is on top of that. So there's 2 layers on top of the studs, green glue in between them. And then you can see when we get to the section for the speaker cutouts, that's going to now go the whole depth of where the back of the studs are. And it's going to pop out far enough that I've got another little section of potentially maybe in the end only about 20mm where the edge of the speaker is before you hit the fabric layer. Even for the absorption panels, there's an air gap behind the mineral wool, which is then set onto that 64mm depth of pine, which is housing the absorption panel. So this is really just a cross-section of how all of that fits so that I could work out how deep did I need to make my fabric wall panels, which would then cover off all of that stuff that's happening onto the wall. Plan 8 is the ceiling plan, and the ceiling plan is trying to just cover 2 things. It's taking those Atmos speaker locations that we had before, but it's also now picking up some spotlights. So along each of the side walls and along the back row, there's a whole series of LED lights, and that's going to be smart lights that are all configured into an Alexa command. So that was trying to work out the locations of those. But also at this stage, I had not worked out what I was going to do on the ceiling for sound absorption. So here I'd actually got 3 different layers that I thought I was going to mount a another absorption panel, and that's the locations where I was going to mark all those out. In the end, I ended up changing this plan and I did a star ceiling. But when I originally drew this, I did not plan on the star ceiling, and I just worked out on these suspended absorption panels at 3 locations. Plan 9 is my electrical plan. Now, I did this because I actually did provide some of this to my electrician that was doing my rest of my house refurbishment, because I needed to have the electricians provide a certain number of circuits down into the room. One was going to be, though, for an electrical circuit, and I did have them do some of the electrical and to leave the actual power points within the room, so that all of the electrical stuff that was going to be wired into that circuit was done by the electrician, whereas the other circuits were just left as power points to the rear where the AV room is, so I could use that for pure power of all the equipment. I think from memory there's something like at least 6 different lighting zones in the room. Part of it is the actual just room lights with the downlights. That's kind of the major ones that are used on and off. There's also some under stair lights on the sides. That's part of another separate zone. There's also some zones in the understair area for the AV rack. There's another lighting zone in there. Along the side walls, the LED that's shown in dark along the 2 side walls is another lighting zone, and that is just sitting over the top of the fabric wall panels. I've also got an LED strip that is actually installed on the top and bottom under the baffle wall. So there's another separate lighting zone where you can light up the top and bottom, which then shines back onto the speaker system behind the screen. And then I've added another lighting zone, which is a smart lighting zone, which again, it's Alexa controlled, and that is running on the top and bottom of the side wall panels. The dimmer switch in the room is one thing that did not work, and I ended up having that removed because that was a little glitchy. And really what I did is I ended up changing and putting in some smart downlights so that that could actually just run on whatever percentage you wanted to do through an Alexa command. So I ended up not needing the dimmer switch because I went to a LifeX bulb, which you could just set by a certain percentage, and that was actually far better. I think that was possibly incompatible with the dimmer switch, so that caused problems. We'll resolve that. But at the same time, having the power points located here, if anything, you can't have too many power points, that's for sure. And having power on the edge of the riser was really important to make that have power to be able to access directly into the back of the chairs for the recliner function. I ended up putting an electrical box set into the riser towards the back of the room, and that's what located all the power that went to those rear chairs. So I did change from what I marked down here, that I didn't need all those power in 4 locations. I did it through a box that was set down and recessed into the rear riser. Plan 10 is all about now the front screen wall, and this was trying to work out how on earth to do these screen panels, which are going to be covered in this black Fidelio velvet. And this was really tricky because the panels here are based around having the final screen dimension, and then the panel somehow being mounted where it wasn't going to stop the blinds and the cables being able to move, as well as it was going to also be mounted in a way where you could still get to the roller blind if you ever need to service it, and it also needed to cover a very wide distance. So I was showing here that, that bottom panel is covering potentially 4.6 meters and somehow just hovering off the wall, where behind it there's something moving up and down. So you can't just sort of like fix it into something because there's things moving behind it. So at that stage I had not worked out how to do that. And the next plan is just purely showing my final design for how I was going to do the roller blind masking. So I've got a top piece which does actually roll back over the roller blind tube, and that then lowers and goes only back to a certain level, never goes up the whole way, because the piece that's actually rolling back over the tube, you never actually see. That's actually hiding behind the panel. So whether or not that velvet was going to have any effect on it from being wound back and up, that part is not visible, whereas the piece that's connected to down the very bottom purely just moves up and down. There's a cable running from the top to the bottom. it lifts up a bar that runs across the length of it, and that piece doesn't actually wind back over a roller blind tube. So that gave me my dimensions as well, because I needed to work out how much extra of the Fidelio velvet I needed to order, and doing of a length like that was obviously very difficult, having to get it cut, and this velvet is not really obviously material that's made to be hung onto a blind, so that was quite challenging, and I'll cover that in my construction videos. The diagram here is really just again showing in purple, that's the amount of material that I'm working with, and it just gave me my final dimensions so I could actually order my parts. So the roller blind tube, I just used this as a way to work with the commercial blinds place that I've eventually found, so I could order the size of the tube and also get their advice on the diameter of the tube, because it needed to be quite a heavy one so that over time there was going to be no sag in that. And I ended up using a roller blind tube which was meant actually for outdoors, so that it covers large gaps between things like verandas, and it needed something much more stronger than something you'd use for an internal curtain blind. And the last diagram I'll show here is my in-depth how that mechanism is going to work. So on the right hand side you can kind of see there's a cable that winds around one section, and then the cable, and there's a gap before the cable then that winds up for the section of the top masking system. And I was just trying to work out how wide did I need to go past the edge of the screen for all this to have enough space for the actual wire to be able to wind up and not be too tight on the width of tube that I had. And then on the left hand side was trying to work out how on earth that cable that's running all this, because one of it is actually now going behind the tube and one of it's going in front of the tube. So that was just trying to work out how that all would operate in practice. So once I had all those drawings, I now had everything that I could work out for dimensions to start measuring up and working out the specifications I needed to go and order materials from. So my document here is now working through all of the sections bit by bit, and I went through the whole room. So all the walls will be finished in a CSR Gyprock sound check product. There's going to be green glue between all the layers of everything. The riser was also going to have 3 layers of OSB on it, and that's all got green glue between it. And then there was also going to be a layer of mass-loaded vinyl that I was going to start using on the top of the riser, so that it dampened out any sound from moving across it whatsoever, as well as I used mass-loaded vinyl completely coating on the back wall. The rear wall has a light layer of MLV attached to it. I also started working through where I was going to be putting vents into the riser in the locations around that. So the insulation I started using across all the room, the ceiling, the bulkhead, and into the walls was all a Bradford Soundscreen acoustic insulation bat, which is an R3.1, because I wanted to maximize how much acoustic performance, and that allowed the room to really contain as much sound as possible, and you can have the room running really loud, especially like late at night, and there's not a huge amount of sound that escapes from it. So going over the top with insulation I think was really important to achieve that. Some of the other things at this stage of planning, I knew at this point that all the doors in the room were going to be solid core doors, again, for acoustic purposes. And one of the things I did actually calculate at this point was actually all the surface levels. So within the room, this is the table here, all the different areas, I calculated what the square meterage was going to be, so that especially when we started talking about things like insulation, paint, plywood backing for everything, or the layers, as well as the Gyprock version that we used, I had square meterage for every wall, so I could work out then how much material would be used and order based on that. So the waves of ordering materials I did was I separated it out from all the construction of the room versus all of the actual more final decorative effects of things like fabric. I did that later. So everything firstly was ordered was all the timber that was needed for the whole construction, all the framing, the OSB boards for the riser, all the plywood sheets for the back of all the sidewalls and the inside lining, all the Gyprock sound check layers, furring channels, Everything that was needed for paint was probably just delayed by a little bit before we ordered. Ordered things like the termite barrier protection, ordered some Auralex floor floaters, which was what was going to house all of the structure for the risers to keep that off the concrete directly. All the insulation was ordered from day one. I had so many bags of insulation. It was in an upstairs room, and it filled the whole entire medium-sized room, as well as like created a whole second layer in it. You literally couldn't move in that room. There were so many bags of insulation. And started ordering all the green glue, all the caulking, and everything that was going to be needed to get the mass-loaded vinyl. So the material itself, the tape for it to have all the joints done, and then all of the other mineral wool. So all the materials had been ordered. They all arrived in time for a 3-week intense burst where I had the carpenter and myself working full-time on this room. My next video is going to show you all that first experience of the framing section to build the room within a room. And it was almost terrifying trying to get this massive side framed wall that was so heavy and trying to lift this wall up into place. It was probably the hardest thing we did in the whole room. The next video, I'm going to show you that in detail. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.